So now, after all these features where we work with the types themselves, so to say, where we worked on checking types, casting to types, let's come back to features that help us write flexible code. Of course, still related to types. It is TypeScript after all, but not so much focused on just the types and how we can manage them. And for that, I want to start with index types, a feature that allows us to create objects which are more flexible regarding the properties they might hold. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say you're writing an application where you're validating some user input. So you have multiple input fields, and depending on what the user enters there and which field it is, you might want to store and eventually show different error messages. For example, if it's an email field, you want to check whether it is an email, and if it is not, you want to add a proper error message to some error container. So that's what I'll start with. I will have my interface error container here. And that should be an object, hence I use an interface here, but it should be flexible regarding what it holds. Ultimately, my goal is that with that we can create objects where we have some error identifier, which could be the ID of the input field to which the error belongs, for example, email, and then some error string, not a valid email. And then we have another property, let's say username, and then an error string we might be storing for that input field if the input is incorrect. Must start with a character. Something like that should be stored in that object. The problem with that is I don't know in advance which exact property names I will have in there. You could say, well, we'll have email and username. But for one, I want this to be a flexible container. I want to be able to use it on any form I have in my web page. And I might have different forms with different inputs with different identifiers. So I don't want to restrict myself to just store email and username errors. And in addition, even if we always had just email and username inputs and we just want to store errors for those, what do we do if just the email is invalid and not the username? Then, of course, in this object, we could store null as a value for a username, but I'd like to just omit it so that we have an object which only holds properties for inputs where we have an error, so that we can also loop through this object with a for in loop to read all the errors we got, for example, and don't have any properties in there which don't actually store an error. So long story short, I need an object where I'm pretty clear regarding the value type. It should be a string, but where I don't know in advance how many properties I'll have and which name the properties will have. And for such a scenario, we can use index types. You define an index type by using square brackets here. Remember, normally we would write a property name here, but now we use square brackets. Then any name of your choice, for example, key or prop, then a colon, and then the value type of the property. And in an object, you can have strings, numbers, or symbols as a property. You, for example, can't use Boolean here. That's not allowed. But you can use string here. With that, I'm simply saying that whatever object I'm constructing based on this error container interface later must have properties which are strings. Username, for example, would be a valid string, even if I don't wrap it in quotes. Then we add a colon, and then the value type, which is string. So with that, I'm saying I don't know the exact property name. I also don't know the property count. I just know that every property which is added to this object, which is based on error container, must have a property name which can be interpreted as a string, and the value for that property also must be a string. That's what I'm saying here. Now with that, we also still can add predefined properties, however, only if they're of the same type as this here. So we could add an ID which is of type string, and then any object we build that adheres to this interface must have an ID property and can add as many other properties as it wants, but we can't set ID to a number here, for example, because we have an index type here. So that is a restriction we have if we build such an object. So now what's the consequence? Now we can create an error bag, for example, which is of type error container. which therefore is an object, and it would be valid like this, because we don't have to add any properties. That is also valid. But of course we can now add some. For example, email, not a valid email. And this is okay. It would not be okay if I instead assigned a number here, because we're saying every property needs a string value type. So we must use a string here. If I use a number here, that would work because that can be interpreted as a string as well. So I can also use a number as a key type here if I wanted to. I'm pretty free regarding what I use here. If I would change the prop type here to number, then you can do that and this would be okay. But this wouldn't, because email is not a number. This can't be converted to a number. It can be treated as a string, but not as a number. So this is how you control which type of properties or which property names you allow. And here I indeed want to allow string property names. So anything which can be converted to a string is a valid property name. And then the value has to be a string as well. And as I said, of course, now we can add multiple values here, multiple properties, I should say. Must start with a capital character. So this is now such a error bag we could build with the help of error container, which gives us this extra flexibility that we don't need to know in advance which property names we want to use and how many properties we need.